I found out my own pontoon boat had been decorated with white flowers and rented out as a floating wedding altar because a neighbor sent me a photo from the Hollow Creek Estate's community Facebook page, a photo showing my boat, unmistakably mine given the faded blue stripe running along the hull my father had painted decades ago, anchored in the middle of the lake with a bride and groom standing on the deck exchanging vows in front of roughly 60 seated guests. My name is Desmond Alderwood. I'm 52 years old, and I keep a 22-foot pontoon boat docked at a private slip behind my house on Hollow Creek Lake, a boat that belonged to my father before me, and that I use maybe a dozen times a year, mostly for quiet fishing trips rather than anything resembling a wedding venue. I want to be clear that I had left for a 9-day business trip the week this happened, and had not, at any point before, during, or after that trip, given a single sole permission to use my boat for anything at all. The photo my neighbor sent arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and I want to describe my exact reaction, because it took me a genuinely confused moment to process what I was actually looking at. There was my boat, floating serenely in the middle of Hollow Creek Lake, adorned with white flowers along the railing, a small string of decorative lights woven through the canopy frame, hosting what was clearly a full wedding ceremony for a bride I had never met, on a boat I had specifically locked and secured before leaving town. I called my neighbor back immediately, a retired schoolteacher named Winifred Aldis who lived 2 houses down, and had clearly been just as confused as I was when she first spotted the post. "It's on the Hollow Creek Estate's community page," she told me. Priscilla Hawthorne posted it herself, actually, bragging about how the HOA arranged such a beautiful venue for her daughter's wedding. I assumed you must have offered it yourself, until I realized you'd been out of town all week. I want to explain who Priscilla Hawthorne was, because her role in this entire situation mattered enormously to how it eventually unfolded. She had served as president of the Hollow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for just over 2 years, and her daughter's wedding, according to the community newsletter that had been circulating for months beforehand, was shaping up to be the social event of the entire community's summer season. I called Priscilla directly that same afternoon, and I want to describe her explanation, because it revealed a level of casual entitlement that genuinely startled me even after everything I'd already seen in that Facebook photo. "Desmond," she said, using my first name despite the fact that we'd only ever exchanged pleasant nods at community events. "I hope you don't mind, but your boat was simply perfect for the ceremony, and since you were out of town anyway, it seemed like it would have just been sitting there unused otherwise. I had my brother-in-law start it up. He's quite handy with boats, and everything went beautifully." "Priscilla," I said, "I never gave you or anyone else permission to access my boat, let alone operate it and use it to host an event for 60 guests. How exactly did your brother-in-law start it in the first place? That boat was locked." There was a pause, the kind that told me the answer wasn't going to be one I wanted to hear. "The marina's dock master let us onto your slip," she said. I explained the situation, and he mentioned there was a spare key in the dock box for emergency access. I didn't think it would be a problem given the circumstances. I want to explain something about that spare key, because it became a significant piece of the eventual dispute. Marinas along Hollow Creek Lake commonly maintain a lockbox system, allowing dock staff emergency access to boats in case of sudden storms or mechanical issues requiring immediate attention while an owner is away. A system I had, in fact, consented to when I first rented my slip, but exclusively for genuine emergencies, never for casual access requests from a neighbor wanting to borrow my boat for a party. I drove straight to the marina office the following morning, and the dock master, a young man named Roosevelt Kim, who had clearly not thought through the implications of his decision very carefully, admitted plainly that Priscilla had approached him directly, explained she was the HOA president and needed access for what she described as an approved community event, and that he had, without verifying anything with me directly, unlocked my boat and allowed her brother-in-law to operate it for the better part of an entire afternoon. I want to describe what I found when I finally inspected my own boat that same day. Beyond the obvious cosmetic decorations, which had at least been removed by the time I arrived, there was a scratch along the hull's port side, consistent with careless docking by someone unfamiliar with the boat's specific handling characteristics, and the fuel gauge showed considerably less than I had left it with before my trip, suggesting the boat had been run for a meaningful stretch of time, beyond simply anchoring for the ceremony itself. I called an attorney, a careful woman named Perpetua Alderwood, who had handled property and liability matters throughout the county for nearly 2 decades. I laid out the full situation, the unauthorized access, the misuse of an emergency-only marina key system, and the physical damage to my boat. This is unauthorized use of personal property, plain and simple, Perpetua told me, once she'd reviewed everything. The fact that she believed her position as HOA president somehow entitled her to access is irrelevant to the actual legal question. I'd recommend formally documenting the damage, requesting the marina's own liability coverage address the scratch, and sending a formal demand to Priscilla directly for any costs the marina's policy doesn't fully cover. I want to be honest that my primary goal at that point wasn't punitive. I wanted the damage repaired. I wanted a clear acknowledgement that this kind of unauthorized use would never happen again. And I wanted, frankly, some assurance that the marina would tighten its own emergency key protocols, so that no other boat owner would return from a trip to find their own property had been rented out as a wedding venue without their knowledge. Priscilla's initial response to Perpetua's formal letter, rather than the straightforward apology and resolution I had hoped for, attempted to characterize the situation as a reasonable community accommodation that I was, in her words, being unreasonably rigid about, given that no permanent harm had resulted, and the wedding itself had been, by every account, a beautiful and memorable event for everyone involved except, apparently, the actual owner of the boat everyone had been standing on. I want to describe what happened next, because it represented the moment this situation escalated from a frustrating but resolvable dispute into something considerably more serious. Roughly a week after Perpetua's formal letter went out, I decided to take my boat out myself for a quiet Sunday afternoon fishing trip, the same way I had dozens of times over the years, only to find, upon arriving at the marina, that Priscilla had apparently informed the dock staff that a dispute existed regarding the boat's ownership and usage rights, and that Roosevelt Kim, still clearly uncertain about his own earlier decision, initially hesitated to release my own boat to me without what he called proper clarification. I showed him my registration, my slip rental agreement, and my driver's license matching the name on both documents, and he eventually relented, allowing me access to my own property after a delay that struck me as considerably more absurd with each passing minute. But I want to describe what happened once I actually got the boat out onto the water, because Priscilla, apparently having been notified by Roosevelt that I'd taken the boat out, called the county sheriff's department directly, reporting what she described as a theft in progress, claiming the boat had been designated for shared community use following the wedding, and that I was removing it without proper authorization. 2 sheriff's deputies met me back at the dock when I returned from my fishing trip roughly 2 hours later, and I want to describe this encounter carefully, because it represented the moment the absurdity of the entire situation finally became undeniable to everyone involved except, apparently, Priscilla herself. A deputy named Foster Alvarez asked me directly for documentation establishing ownership, and I provided the same registration and slip agreement I'd shown Roosevelt Kim earlier that same day. "Sir," Deputy Alvarez said, after reviewing everything carefully, "this documentation clearly establishes you as the registered owner. Can you explain the reporting party's claim that this vessel was designated for community use?" I explained the entire situation plainly. The wedding, the unauthorized access through the marina's emergency key system, and Perpetua's formal demand letter regarding the resulting damage and unauthorized use. Deputy Alvarez's expression shifted noticeably as I described the sequence of events, and he informed me plainly that no theft had occurred, that I was simply operating my own registered vessel, and that any further complaints along these lines could potentially expose the reporting party to liability for filing a false police report. I want to explain what emerged once Perpetua formally pursued the matter through the marina's own management, and separately, through a renewed and considerably more pointed demand directed at Priscilla herself. The marina, once it understood the full scope of what Roosevelt Kim's decision had exposed them to, immediately overhauled its emergency key protocol, requiring direct owner confirmation via phone before any emergency access could be granted going forward, along with a formal apology and coverage of the hull damage through their own liability insurance, rather than requiring me to pursue Priscilla individually for that specific cost. The false police report, however, became a separate and considerably more serious matter. Perpetua filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department regarding Priscilla's report of a theft that both deputies on scene had confirmed was baseless. A report that, once formally reviewed, resulted in Priscilla receiving a citation for filing a false report. A citation that carried its own modest fine, but more significantly, created an official record considerably at odds with the community reputation she had spent 2 years carefully cultivating as an effective, reasonable association leader. The Hollow Creek Estates Board held an emergency session once word of the false report citation spread through the community, and I attended alongside Perpetua and Winifred Aldis, who'd offered to describe how she'd first discovered the situation through the community Facebook post. A board member named Cassius Delgado, who had served alongside Priscilla for just over a year, asked the question that seemed to capture the room's collective disbelief. "Priscilla," he said, "you called the sheriff on a man for taking out his own registered boat after your own family used it without his permission in the first place. What exactly did you think was going to happen when the deputies actually checked the paperwork?" Priscilla's answer offered little beyond a defensive insistence that she had genuinely believed, in the moment, that some kind of community usage arrangement had been established, an explanation that satisfied nobody in that room given the clear timeline showing she had received Perpetua's formal demand letter, explicitly asserting my sole ownership and lack of consent, more than a week before she ever called the sheriff's department. The board voted that same night to formally request Priscilla's resignation from the presidency, a request she accepted within days rather than face what would have likely become a considerably more public and drawn-out removal process. Cassius Delgado stepped in as interim president, and one of his first actions was drafting a formal community policy explicitly prohibiting any association leadership position from facilitating or authorizing use of individual residents' private property for community events without documented, direct owner consent. A policy that should have existed already, but somehow never had. My boat sits back in its slip now, undamaged and, as far as I know, permanently free of decorative wedding flowers, and I've made a point of personally speaking with the marina's new dock master about exactly what emergency access actually means going forward. I still take it out most Sundays when the weather cooperates, the same quiet fishing trips my father used to take me on decades ago, and I've found, since all of this settled, that most of Hollow Creek Estates residents I encounter these days seem to find the entire story considerably more amusing than I did while it was actually happening. Though I'll admit that time and a properly resolved outcome have a way of making even the strangest ordeals feel a bit more like a good story than a genuine grievance. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether someone has ever used something of yours without asking, only to act indignant when you wanted it back. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.